Welcome in, everybody.
Hello, hello.
My name is Ben Mayer.
My name is Anthony Buono.
We are here with episode 4 of Everything Sucks, Let's Fix It.
What a fantastic name.
I'm stunned positively every time I hear it. Today is June 4th, 2023. We're going to talk some politics. Do you want to recap the format again?
Yeah, for sure. So first things first, we're going to start off with some current events. That'll normally take... No, I don't like that.
Don't lay it out.
I don't like that at all.
You don't want to introduce?
No, I'd like to introduce it, but I don't like what I just said. We got to start over.
No,
Sorry.
we don't.
No, we do.
I'm not going to edit this out.
You have to.
No. No, I don't.
You have so much power over me.
So, the format.
Oh, no.
It's going to be current events. Then we can do a book club. We read some of a book and we're going to discuss it. And then we're going to go deep dive. Today, we are deep diving into the U.S. and China.
We have been teasing this for a while.
I am so excited.
I am also very excited.
I have been personally getting into this topic so much.
I feel like this is what got you interested in politics.
It honestly
recently.
is.
This is what re-inspired your interest.
Yeah, well, I would say it was actually Ukraine and Russia first.
Oh, sure.
Because that's really when like the geopolitical pieces on the board started moving much faster than they had been before. But China is a huge part of that. So
yeah, for sure.
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm stoked.
Okay.
And we read a really good paper about it too.
Yes. From a very interesting person.
Yes.
I don't know if you looked into her.
I did.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
But current events. Debt ceiling.
Let us begin with the conclusion of an epic saga.
Yes.
The debt ceiling is finally over. The agreement is reached. It's voted on. Biden has signed it. It's done. Default has been avoided. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah. This is our third week talking about it, which just goes to show.
Right.
Yeah.
This has been capturing, our American current events for the past month.
Before we even get into the nitty-gritty of the deal and the politics of it, I read this article in the Washington Post that went like behind the scenes, behind the curtain of the deal making.
That's the best.
So interesting. Like how Biden and McCarthy have never had a working relationship before.
Mm-hmm.
McCarthy had these like two other representatives on his side, and Biden had these mediators working for him. And there were two people who happened to go and like live in the same place in Louisiana.
No way.
On both sides, that was able to create connections between them.
See, that's interesting that a personal relationship was able to mediate some political disagreement like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Because the personal relationships do matter at every level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always important to remember there are people inside these institutions that at the end of the day, they're making a lot of the deals, and how they're able to get along actually matters in how, our government functions.
Absolutely. And that makes me think too, like we've been talking a lot about the Kevin McCarthy having his job as speaker on the line. And that's something where you think like it's a very human worry to have, like to have this job and to not want to get demoted, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, now let's go into it, right? McCarthy has been wanting to be the speaker for 10 years, since 2010. This is what he's wanted. And he's allied with specific people to get into this position. And now that he's here, he doesn't want to blow it, because in 2011, during the debt fight then, Speaker Boehner of the Republican House blew it and lost the trust of the Republican base, and they kicked him out in 2015. And McCarthy doesn't want that same record. McCarthy was the guy fighting against Boehner back in the day.
Okay.
So now McCarthy is seeing this, and he's like, I don't want to repeat that fate, So it passed in the House of Representatives first. McCarthy promised Hakeem Jeffries, who is the Democratic leader of the House, that he would be able to carry along 150 Republicans to vote for the bill. Mm-hmm. He only got 149.
That's so funny.
It's so funny, right?
Yeah.
It's
to
hilarious.
Be one off.
But like what that says about his leadership ability, he doesn't have the ability to whip his caucus the way that Nancy Pelosi had over the Democratic caucus. The Democrats are pretty divided between the progressives and the moderates and the blue dogs. But when it came down to a vote, Nancy Pelosi had it together.
True.
McCarthy doesn't have that ability.
Why do you think that is? Like, is it because, to me, it's the idea is that the base of the hard right Republicans are far enough removed from reality that it doesn't actually matter if the results of their actions and their legislation hurts their base. They trust that much that the base is going to stay with them.
I think that's accurate. I don't think that they're really in it for I think the hard right base isn't in it for the outcomes. They're in it for the win. You know what I mean? They're in it for the win.
Exactly.
And we talked about this last time. The Republican base in the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus is the hardcore right of the House of Representatives. They wanted a 22% cut to every federal department, minus the veterans stuff and the military in the discretionary portion of our budget. They got a 1% increase. So they're in a massive upheaval right now. And the Freedom Caucus, guys like Andy Biggs, who Andy Biggs was trying to get McCarthy's job a little over 6 months ago. Andy Biggs is lobbying to put up a motion to vacate and kick McCarthy out. You have guys like Matt Gaetz, who of course is trying to push McCarthy out.
Yeah.
So McCarthy's in a really difficult spot. And what McCarthy promised them was the majority of senators in the Senate, the majority of Republican senators will vote for this bill. But when it came to the Senate, they didn't win the majority of Republican senators. This passed with more Democrat senators than Republican senators. Only 4 Democrat senators voted against it. Every other Democratic senator voted for it. So, and the reasons Republicans didn't vote for it are all over the place. Some people think it didn't cut enough. Other people think it didn't spend enough.
On military.
Like
Lindsey Graham.
There we go. Lindsey Graham gave a speech alongside Susan Collins. Susan Collins is from Maine. Lindsey Graham is from South Carolina. Lindsey Graham is a very prominent Republican. He ran for president a little while ago. I think 2012? 2016? Okay. And he was saying that there wasn't enough money for the military budget. Talking about the Navy statistics. Susan Collins was going off about how many ships we were going to have.
Versus China.
Yes. Seems to be a theme.
Yeah.
Weird. And, it's interesting how that was the dichotomy, because the House of Representatives was not really pushing for an increase in the military budget. And on the right, people like to talk about this thing called the uniparty. You hear that phrase a lot in right-wing circles, the uniparty. It's the Democrats and the Republicans working together to screw over the people, the uniparty. Okay. And when those speeches were coming out, the Republican response was, oh, this is Lindsey Graham being a part of the uniparty. And the uniparty's deal was, we'll increase domestic spending if you increase military spending. So that's how Democrats and Republicans have historically worked together. Mitch McConnell will go to Joe Biden and say, okay, I'll raise domestic spending if you raise military spending. And they would work in tandem. And the Freedom Caucus was like, what if we cut both? And then kind of breaks down that uniparty thing, that uniparty compromise. So Susan Collins, Lindsey Graham, not happy. And it's crazy.
Yeah. It really was a political drama fest.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which is interesting. The one other thing we have here is the Mountain Valley Pipeline.
And that's a really, we issue. Definitely got to talk about
well,
that.
I guess because we talk about the Republican side, but there's also a liberal side of this.
Right.
And my view of this was always that, and I think the accurate analysis would be that Biden, Schumer would be able to whip the party enough to get the votes to pass the bill. And I think that's definitely what it seemed like when this initially got to the Senate. So when it first went into the Senate, Schumer made a speech about how they were not going to end the session until the bill was passed. They had 11 amendments proposed.
And Schumer wanted no amendments. Schumer made it a point. He's like, do not propose any amendments. We need to pass this now.
Yeah.
But people didn't listen. They did propose amendments.
Well, because people wanted to air their grievances, and they can
make videos to post on Twitter.
Exactly. They can use their speeches and potentially their votes against the bill for political currency.
Yeah, true.
Basically. So you have like Bernie Sanders did not vote for the bill because of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which I should say now is this gas pipeline going from West Virginia into Virginia, that Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia has been pushing for years. It's been working through an approvals process since 2017.
That's unbelievable.
Courts have continued to strike it down because the developers aren't doing it the right way, aren't treating the environment correctly. And so what we had now was this unprecedented language in this bill that specifically green lights this Mountain Valley Pipeline, and loops it, kind of takes an end around the courts. Like it takes out their knees, and it says that it calls the Mountain Valley Pipeline something about being integral to American security, and so that it should go through without any resistance.
Wow.
And something that I read afterwards is that this is paying back Joe Manchin for his vote yes on the Inflation Reduction Act.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which does make a lot of sense, because Manchin, we know he was the lone holdout vote that was waiting to get that passed. And it was a huge deal when it was announced that he was going to vote yes.
Yeah.
So one of the amendments, there were 11 proposed. One of them was from Senator Tim Kaine out of Indiana?
Virginia.
Out of Virginia.
That's why it was affecting his state.
Yes, that makes sense. To remove the language about the Mountain Valley Pipeline. That didn't pass because, again, this is part of Schumer whipping the Democrats, is that if any of these amendments pass, the bill has to go back to the House, get passed there, and by then it would have been too late.
Right.
Like we would have defaulted.
Exactly. But interesting, Lindsey Graham, I want to say something else about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, but Lindsey Graham was actually okay with extending a clean debt ceiling increase for 90 more days to try to get a better deal. That wasn't going to happen, though. After all this negotiation, no one was done. Everyone was away from the table. We're voting now.
Yeah.
But with the Mountain Valley Pipeline thing, Tim Kaine coming out and proposing that amendment, I thought was really courageous. And courageous and Tim Kaine was not something I would ever thought I would say in the same sentence. But I have to say, the fact, this is a pretty establishment guy. He went against the party leadership, proposed this amendment, and I'm pretty happy about that. And I'm also pretty happy to see that 30 Democrats voted to get this out of the legislation. Still obviously failed 69 to 30, but it was 30 who voted to kick it out.
Why do you think it's courageous?
Well, because when the leader of your party tells you not to do something and you do it anyway, you're threatening losing a committee assignment. You're threatening losing establishment funding for your next election. You know what I mean? It takes a lot to say, like, I know you want me to do this, but I'm doing something else and I don't care what you're going to do to me.
I suppose. I wonder, I would assume there was a meeting behind closed doors, probably between Kaine and Schumer, that was like, hey, look, like I need to be able to tell my constituency that I voted against this, that I not only voted against this, that I tried specifically, I wrote an amendment to get it out of the law.
And if I was Tim Kaine, I would do that exactly. Totally. I would go to Schumer and I would say, look, this is what I'm going to do. I hope this doesn't get you too mad.
Yeah.
But this is what I'm going to do, and I hope you can respect that.
And that's how I see the votes of the dissenting Democrats as well. It's just like, we know it's going to pass. We need to be able to say that we didn't support these parts of it. It's all for show.
All for show.
Like the Democrats knew they couldn't default.
No, of course.
Yeah.
And what I just think it's so interesting that after all of this, Biden walks away as the winner. Biden walks away saying, we got this deal done. The Democrats were united and the Republicans weren't. I think Biden can walk away from this. I don't think it's a victory because I'm not a fan of the deal. Right? I don't like what it does to food stamps. I don't like what it does to the IRS. I don't like what it does with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I don't like those things. I don't like how it doesn't raise taxes to address the deficit. But Biden is able to walk away from this and say, I avoided economic catastrophe despite Republican opposition. You know what I mean? I think he's able to walk away from this and be viewed as
I just see it neutral.
You see it totally neutral.
I see it like McCarthy didn't default and he got some of what he wanted. Biden didn't default and he got some of what he wanted.
Well, I see McCarthy walking away with a strong approval too. But I don't see Republicans walking away with a strong approval. I see McCarthy walking away as like, oh, one of the reasonable ones.
Okay.
And then I see the rest of the Republicans who didn't line up for it as being like, they're untrustworthy. Trusting this party with the government isn't worth it because there's too many extremists in there.
Okay.
But I think McCarthy looks pretty good after this.
So the Republican Party as a whole loses because of the dissent that this has shown.
That's what I think. That's my analysis.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's my analysis.
Cool.
But now we're talking about environmental stuff. There's another thing going on over in Colorado, right?
Yes. So in the American Southwest, there's been this thing that has gotten some news attention, but not a ton. And I've just been weirdly into geography at varying points in the past few months. So this caught my attention. if anyone has been to the American Southwest in the past decade, you know that it's in a severe drought, really bad drought. And it's gotten bad enough where the Colorado River has been at risk of actually stopping its flows. The Colorado River runs through Colorado all the way down past the Mexican border, and the basin for the Colorado River supplies water for 40 million plus people, including the metros of Denver, Los Angeles, San Diego, Phoenix, Las Vegas, all of the big cities down there. It also supports a ton of American agriculture, including about 80% of the farming that is done to supply the country in the winter. So this is a big deal. Like, not having water in these places can be catastrophic, not just for the region, but for the whole country as far as food supply.
Do we know how we messed up the projection so bad with how much water we were going to have?
Yeah. So the history here is there are 7 states in the Colorado River Agreement, and this agreement was made in the 1920s. I don't know the exact year, but these are the states that draw water from the basin, and they're California. I hope I can remember all of them. It's California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, maybe Utah. Maybe Utah.
I think it's Utah.
And then I cannot remember the 6th one. But the main players, the important characters here. Well, first of all, why are we in drought? So there are 2 reasons. One is there's been overallocation of the water, because in the 20s, when the agreement was first made, it was made on the basis of data that was taken in about the past 10 to 20 years, which was an unusually wet period.
Of course it was.
Yes. But the weird thing is, and I looked into this deeply enough to know, that scientists knew that at the time.
Whoa.
And all of the stakeholders in the states just wanted to be able to take more water.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
But it's classic America,
that's
right?
Classic.
It's like, don't care about the long-term consequences so that we can have more in the short term.
That's classic.
So that's been contributing to the misallocation. Past that, the other obvious reason is climate change.
Of course.
I mean, we would have naturally been in a drought for about the past 20 years is what geologists are saying, but it's been made about 40% worse because of climate change.
Wow.
Is the estimations.
Science and geology is amazing that we're able to actually understand what percentage of this is due to climate change and the abnormalities of the weather because of that, right?
It is so
That's
cool.
incredible.
Yeah.
But so is there a plan that they're doing to try to fix this?
Yeah. So the politics of this now is California is the lowest basin state. And so there's something, interestingly enough, if you get into geology, you realize how much the government has to be a part of these land and water use rights.
Yeah,
and
sure.
So there's something called the law of the river, which generally gives the most rights, the most amount of water access to states that are at the lowest end of the river basin. So the Colorado River runs north-south, which means California is the state with the right to the most water. So in negotiations, it thus has the most bargaining power. And it doesn't really have to agree to cede any of its water use.
Wow.
So what had happened is the states actually, I think last August, had been told that they need to come up with a plan to reduce water usage because the river was going to be in a drought. But they hit the deadline, passed it, no plan that has come to.
Classic America.
Classic America. And so it doesn't come up into the news again until there's another report that's like, in these 2 lakes, and one I think is at the Hoover Dam, there's something called a dead pool level of the lakes, where that if the water is not a certain amount high, they won't flow through. So it won't flow through the dams.
Oh, geez.
And the river flows will stop. And when that happens, no more water for all this agriculture, no more water for the people of Phoenix, Los Angeles, and all these other cities. And so it comes back and the states are like, okay, now we actually have to get to the table and start doing some work here. And so again, they go back, and at first, 6 of the 7 states are in agreement on a plan for all of them to reduce water use.
Okay.
but California
Oh my God.
is still holding out.
Why?
Because they can, because they want their golf courses. They want
their almond production. I think it should be legal to plant almonds. You know how much water is used in the farming of almonds? Get them out. And it's not just because I'm allergic, okay?
And they're mostly exported. Like they're not actually necessary for.
How do you know that? That is awesome. You just know. You know our trade deficit in relation to our almond export.
Yeah, I guess so. But so the reason we're bringing this up now, all this stuff had been happening for months and months and months. And about a week and a half ago, the states finally did agree.
Oh, thank God.
And I hate to say that I don't know a ton of specifics besides the agreement is going to reduce water use by about 3 million acre feet over the next 3 years.
I have no understanding of what 3 million acre feet of water looks like.
I know. I imagine it's just like an acre. It's like a foot of water on an acre. It is that volume.
Okay.
So 3 million acres.
I mean, that sounds like a lot of water.
Is a lot.
Okay.
It should be helpful.
Okay.
But it is an interesting story.
And that's going to be that's going to be a political nightmare for a lot of the governors or everything when like they start having to make laws to limit water usage.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure most water usage comes in through industry or agriculture.
That's the thing. Most of it is overused by big agribusinesses.
There you go. That's what I thought.
So
anyway.
But again, we're talking about America. So are they really going to take it out of
how are you going to crack
those
down?
places?
Or are they going to come down on the residential areas? But residential areas don't use that much water. I mean, I was looking at some projections that are like 6% of water usage comes from residential areas and so much is coming from agriculture. It's not even comparable, really.
Yeah.
You know? So I don't know how much water they could claw out of that, but I'm really glad that they came to a deal and were able to work together there because that's really scary.
Yeah. We talked about the water war happening between Iran and Afghanistan last week, and it's right within our borders.
Yeah.
Now, so.
Okay. So talk about deal making. We have a super... do you like my transitions?
You are on your transition.
I'm on fire right
today.
Now.
Yeah.
So a very interesting alliance has been taped together in the Senate right now between Elizabeth Warren and J.D. Vance. Now, J.D. Vance is a very conservative, America First Republican, very America First. He's the guy who wrote Hillbilly Eulogy. It's this guy from Ohio. It was a very popular book. And he is interesting because he really bucks with the Republican Party. He is really economically populist. Mm. And a lot of the pro-business Republicans don't really like him. Like, you know, in the Washington Post editorial pages, in the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages, they're not a big fan of J.D. Vance. But right now, J.D. Vance and Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts are working together to try to punish the CEOs and executives of failed banks. Now, this is in response to the Silicon Valley Bank failure a couple months ago. And what Vance and Warren are working together to try to propose is it would require the FDIC to claw back the compensations from executives of large banks that have over $10 billion in reserves of the last 3 years worth of compensation. Mm-hmm. So executives would have a very strong incentive to not have their bank fail because they are going to be personally held accountable for their institution's failure. Mm-hmm. I think this is a really awesome piece of legislation.
Yeah.
I think it's like, I don't know how it doesn't like obviously raise a lot of money for the FDIC. It's not going to be a big source of revenue for the government, but it is a better regulation of holding individuals accountable. You know, when they do so much damage to so many, having laws that directly affect these individuals in very high positions of power, I think is a really good step. Yeah. And to see it coming from Republican and Democrat unity here, I think is really cool.
I agree. It's interesting because I was going to make the comparison to the book we just read, which talked so much about the woes of financialization and what it's done to the American people. But I think this will partly do that, but it's still, banks can still very freely exploit people. This is only hopefully protecting against banks going under themselves, which does, of course, hurt people as that happens. But I don't know. It should be
But again, it's not. The legislation is interesting to me not because of how effective it is or how like really special it is, but the fact that you have a Republican senator with J.D. Vance and even Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, who are again very conservative people, but they're economically populist in a way that progressives are able to work with them. Mm-hmm. And if this is the type of bipartisanship that we can expect in the future, I'm really excited.
I agree.
Because if this could be, like we talked a little bit before about the uniparty, if we could have a new uniparty consensus around punishing Wall Street, mm-hmm. I'll sign up for that.
Totally.
That's the type of bipartisanship I want to see. And, you know, it's upsetting to see Republicans honestly shit on J.D. Vance for negotiating with Elizabeth Warren.
Have they been?
Yeah, and that it's, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's because J.D. Vance is valuing cultural issues over economic issues. That's where his politics are, you know?
Sure.
In a lot of ways, he's more liberal in his economics and in some instances, not in regards to immigration, you know, but
sure.
When we talk about bank regulation, yeah, he will be.
Have you seen any Democrats shitting on Elizabeth Warren?
No.
Okay.
And that's a good sign.
Well, that's why I wonder, is this a Biden effect?
Ooh.
Like, in being the everyman, almost, Biden inspires even the very hard left liberals to negotiate with the people on the right and to be okay with finding compromise there.
Yeah.
Because that would be wonderful.
And I think it's been so long since we've seen something like that. And I think like, I just think it's a really good sign that Elizabeth Warren and J.D. Vance were literally calling each other on their cell phones, trying to talk it out, hash it out, long conversations, trying to be on the same team. And it makes me feel like this is something that could actually happen because they're committed to this. And I don't know if it could pass in a Republican House, but in 2024, if the Democrats take the House back, I can absolutely see something like this passing in the Senate, going to the House, and this actually being a bipartisan success.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to see Washington respond to something that was so scary for the American people, which is a massive bank collapsing.
Yeah.
I would love to see Washington be able to respond.
Well, this is the type of legislation that should have been enacted after the financial crisis of 2008.
Exactly. That's such a great point. We should have brought out the stick back then.
Yeah.
We always talk about carrot and the stick politics. Mm-hmm. This is a stick politics.
Yeah.
This is if you do something wrong, we're going to beat you, you know?
Yeah.
And we didn't get that in 2008, but if we can get it now, you know,
it can help us moving forward.
It could help us move forward. And I'd love to see that.
That is exciting. We can hope.
Now, last thing about economics here. We have the May jobs report. I went on a little bit of a deep dive here, and I did a lot of data analysis on this jobs report. And it had some really interesting stuff in it, and especially what we're going to talk about in a little bit, I think. First things first, we added about 350,000 jobs in the month of May. This defied expectations. People thought we were about to be entering recession territory. People, especially with like the default coming up. So we were in like a doom and gloom era of American economics. Okay. Mm-hmm. And this jobs report blew everyone out of the water. People online were responding like, did they fake the numbers? Is this fake? Like, how could this be real? Mm-hmm. And we saw an interesting dynamic where we added 350,000 jobs, but our unemployment rate still went up. So what that means is there's a little bit of a discrepancy with the data. Something's probably going to get adjusted. Either the employment rate was too high and it's going to get corrected down, or the jobs or numbers being reported were a little too high and they're going to get pulled down.
I was wondering about that. Well, I was wondering if there are other explanations to this. I figured like it's not like there's been a massive immigration, but could it be something about college graduations or high school graduations having happened in the month?
But they're seasonally adjusted. They're seasonally adjusted. Seasonally adjusted means it's comparing every May to the past May. So it's not, So that 350,000 number it's already adjusted for all those externalities.
I see.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's already adjusted for all that. You know, but I was thinking the same thing at first.
Yeah.
Now, the stock market reacted great. The Dow Jones jumped like 700 points the morning this thing was announced. Everyone was stoked. And when we break down where these jobs were created, we saw the most amount of jobs coming from education and healthcare, which is not surprising. Healthcare and education and tech like that. Business services is the next most prominent. Tech services, another massive aspect of our economy. Government jobs were still growing, Now, what I found interesting about this was the most amount of government jobs that were getting created were coming from local governments. Now, this is a result of American Rescue Plan funding that was passed 2 years ago still being used. And I know this from a firsthand perspective because if anyone doesn't know, I'm an elected official in the town of Brookline, and we just passed...
Massachusetts.
Yeah, Brookline, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And we just passed our yearly budget, and we're using American Rescue Plan funding to fix a lot of the roads in our community.
Okay.
So that local government job boost is still because of American Rescue Plan stuff.
Interesting.
The bad news, because there is a little bit. Manufacturing jobs went down. Now, Biden's big push in this country has been to bring back manufacturing, just like every American president over the last 20 years, right? Mm-hmm. That's what every American president says. But unfortunately, they declined slightly this month, only by 2,000 jobs, but it is a decline, and that's not the trend you want to see. Mm-hmm. A specific aspect of manufacturing jobs that I want to zoom in on are semiconductor jobs. We saw a decrease of 2,000 semiconductor-related jobs. Now, semiconductors are one of the most important aspects of our economy. They are vital to our economic growth and vital to our international competition, especially with China. And after the passing of the CHIPS Act, a lot of that money isn't in use yet. So this number will go up. But this was one of the first decreases in a long time of continued growth. Yeah,
I was confused about that because of the CHIPS Act. Right. And it makes sense that that money isn't, like that money is being used to build the factories that are going to employ the people right now. But it was hard. I don't see an explanation for why the decrease, except what is just now coming to my mind. Have you heard about the recent NVIDIA earnings call?
No.
Okay. So NVIDIA announced a ton of AI integration into their production system.
No way.
Yeah. And its stock jumped enormously. I was just perusing Wall Street Bets a week ago or something, and there were people who had made like 3,000% on their NVIDIA stock.
Wow.
So I don't know if this could be a trend across the industry, that people are losing their jobs because AI is taking them over.
That's really interesting. That's a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, see, semiconductors is an industry that I want to see grow. Now, I would hate to see an industry that I want to see grow be completely captured by AI.
Yeah.
And then that national pie that we always talk about on the show isn't getting distributed correctly.
Yeah.
That stinks.
Yeah.
Hopefully the CHIPS Act can save a lot of that. Hopefully.
Yeah.
You know, maybe more people to program the AI, but that's going to be a theme in this economy for a long time.
Totally. Well, we're going to have to do an AI deep dive.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But now what I want to bring this back to Stiglitz because what this jobs report showed was the continued transition to the service economy.
Yes.
This jobs report showed that we saw the most amount of job growth in education, in healthcare, in food service, decline in manufacturing. So we're transitioning into this service economy that we have been for over a decade. And now we're building back out of the COVID era, and that hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. And, you know, legislators have to make a lot of hard decisions if they're going to, and really put the pedal to the metal with some policy legislation, if they're going to want to get that manufacturing back and try to integrate more of that into our economy and not just have it be a service economy.
Yes, which I think is what they're trying to do with chips.
Which is what they're trying to do with chips. And I do agree. I think having I think totally selling off our manufacturing base is a terrible idea. I know that some people think it would be a good idea to lean into the service sector and totally just lean into the service economy, but for national security reasons, it's not a good move.
Yeah. Yeah. We need, I mean, now this is something that we haven't really talked about, but there's at least one very smart person who I pay attention to who has been kind of yelling that we are heading towards deglobalization and we're heading towards it rapidly.
Yeah.
And he's been saying that for a very long time. And the Ukraine war has only accelerated it further.
Definitely.
Which means that being able to build things in-house is getting more important than it really ever has been in the past, at least 30, 40 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one other thing that I caught on this jobs report was the construction jobs being added. And so there were 25,000 construction jobs added on this, 2,400 specifically in residential construction, which I just mentioned because in our first episode, we did a deep dive on housing and specifically on zoning reforms. But one thing that we mentioned that I'll mention again is that we have a pretty big housing shortage in this country. And that's something that is felt very acutely in our own Boston metro area.
Yes.
So I was excited to see that. And one other thing that I checked into there is there are more residences under construction than there ever have been since like 1980.
That is,
I think,
amazing.
Yeah.
That is amazing to see.
It is exciting. So hopefully we'll see more growth in that sector.
And I think the infrastructure plan has a lot to do with the increase in construction jobs. The infrastructure bill passed last year.
What part of it?
When we're talking about rebuilding bridges, refurnishing airports, redoing all these things, re-upping ports, right? These are massive construction projects that are going to employ a lot of people. And I think that we're seeing that starting to reflect in the jobs numbers.
Do you think that, are you saying like that goes to the construction numbers or do you think it connects to the residential?
No, I don't think it connects to the residential.
Okay.
No, I don't think it connects to the residential. It only connects to the construction stuff. I don't know what could explain the residential, to be honest.
I think
just demand.
The housing shortage noise is getting louder.
Maybe.
I think so.
Because we've talked about, again, on the first episode, for all the OGs out there who's watched that, it's like a lot of communities are now changing their zoning to encourage more development for the first time in a while.
Yes.
So hopefully that's trickling down and we see that in the jobs numbers on the higher level there.
Yeah.
All right. Let's transition to some global affairs.
Yes. Okay. This was really interesting to me. So I went pretty deep on this. There has been some unrest in Kosovo, which is this country.
It's pronounced Kosovo.
Kosovo? Well, I was just going to say, I didn't know it existed until I saw this news. It's this little Balkan country that is right between Serbia and Albania. And so the unrest is coming mostly in this northern region, which borders Serbia. And I would highly recommend anyone who's watching this to bring up a map because I feel like it'll be super helpful. Yeah. But there's a northern region that is majority Serbian, still in Kosovo. And they are loyal to the Serbian government.
And they have been for a long time.
Yes. So there's a lot of history here. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which both of these countries were a part of, Kosovo and Serbia wanted to keep Kosovo as part of its own country, as part of Serbia. But Kosovo wanted to be its own country. So there was a war, and Kosovo didn't break off. But then years later, in 2008, they signed an agreement to govern. In 2008, they unilaterally declared independence. Mm-hmm. Serbia still didn't recognize it. Russia, China didn't recognize it. Slowly, more countries have recognized it. The Western countries always have.
Yeah. The Western Bloc has always been pro-Kosovo.
Yes.
There was a big deal in the 90s with the bombing of a lot of Serbian areas because the NATO allies were defending Kosovo from Serbian incursions.
Interesting.
And this was leading to a lot of genocide back then. A lot of genocide in this area between the Serbs and the Albanians in Kosovo.
I didn't know that at all.
And the NATO stepped in to try to stop that genocide. And now it was after the fall of Yugoslavia. So, yes. And in that breakup, there was just so much ethnic hatred. And the Serbs in Kosovo were aligning with the Serbian government. And then there were fights with Croatia, and it was a whole mess throughout the 90s. So this is only really getting settled now, and you can't even call it settled because of what happened recently.
Yeah, it's not getting settled. So in 2013, it seemed like it was getting settled, because in 2013, they signed an agreement where Serbia, even though it didn't officially recognize Kosovo as an independent country, it gave it the right to rule. But in that agreement, Serbia negotiated for the majority Serbian regions in Kosovo to form an association of Serbian municipalities, which would have special governing rights over the association.
That's so difficult.
Even though they're still within Kosovo.
When you try to have these governments that have local, tinier governments that are honestly almost loyal to another country.
Literally hostile to the national government.
Right.
Yeah. And so because of how problematic that would be, the association wasn't formed because they couldn't agree between the national government and the Serbian regions what the extent of the powers of the municipal association would be.
Right.
Fast forward to 2023 now. No, to 2022, late 2022. That agreement still hasn't happened. That association still has not been formed.
Oh my God.
And there are Serbian leaders, so both in Serbia and within Kosovo, who are trying to get this association formed. And to do so, Serbian mayors in the Kosovo areas that are majority Serb resign in protest of not having this association. Business goes on as usual, and because all these mayors resigned, the next step is to elect new mayors. And in the upcoming elections, which were going to happen at the time that is now about 2 weeks ago, the Serbians in these Serbian majority areas are all in agreement to boycott the elections.
Oh, God.
So turnout ends up being horrifically low. We're talking 3% turnout.
Oh, my God.
And there are these Albanian mayors, because, so I don't think I've said this yet, Kosovo is like 6% Serbian, 92% Albanian. But the Serbian majority regions are very Serbian. So when Albanian mayors get elected in these Serbian majority regions, because
they have no credibility.
Exactly, none at all, and that is exactly the rationale that the protesters are now using, and it's gotten violent, is the thing. And so NATO has sent in a bunch of its peacekeeping troops. I think it's about to get up to 3,000.
Wow.
Italian troops are there. I think Hungarian, and I think Turkey just announced that it's sending some of its as well. There have been several injuries to NATO troops, and hundreds of the protesters have been injured. So
wow.
it's like bad.
That's crazy.
The only other wrinkle I'll talk about here, because I don't want to go on for too long, is there is still an element of the geopolitical West versus Russia bloc happening here. And there's speculation that the Russian, the communist side has intentionally drummed up the unrest and the conflict, because right now Kosovo exists,
right?
So it doesn't really have anything to lose, and it sees that if it can grab these little regions of Kosovo, which are currently Serbian majorities, that'll only the Russian, Chinese, or the communist side only has something to gain,
right? And Serbia has been in Russia's proto-bloc for a while.
Yes.
It's kind of unfair to say Serbia is in Russia's bloc. That's kind of controversial, but they're in the sphere. They're basically in the sphere.
I really thought they were in the bloc.
It's hard because they don't come out. The Serbians won't come out and say like Russia is totally fine for Ukraine. It's not like unilaterally agreed upon that Russia isn't at fault for the Ukraine stuff.
Okay.
But, you'll have like 40% of the country say it's the Ukraine's fault. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So it's like in the sphere. It's not like Belarus or something.
Okay. I actually was getting those two mixed up in my head.
No, Belarus is like deep in the Russian sphere, where Serbia is more outskirts. But again, why does Serbia have such a distrust of the West? Because they were bombed by NATO in the 90s.
Yep.
That's why they have the distrust. Now, another controversial opinion, I agree with that bombing, and that is not very popular among progressives, but I do agree with that bombing. So did Bernie Sanders, by the way. Anyway, let's not go on about that.
Yeah, let's not.
That's a whole other topic. Okay. So, is there anything else you want to say about Serbia?
No, I want to transition.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah,
let's do it.
So, the other thing I want to talk about, which I guess can kind of be tied into geology as well.
It's so interesting because you are like the international relations guy.
I am.
You really are.
I love it.
Yeah,
I'm so interested.
You're so interested in the chess game that's going on.
Yes, I love the chess game. So the element to talk about here is the US and Australia recently came to an agreement. And so I read most of the White House fact sheet on this, the agreement is basically to try to increase ties between the two countries to accelerate the green transition.
Yeah.
The reason this is really important is because Australia is the world's biggest producer of lithium. Lithium is arguably, but probably, the most important element to be used in all green tech, including
it's integral to everything.
Exactly. So to be in cahoots with Australia this tightly is super helpful for the U.S. They talked about how they're forming a dedicated forum on clean energy industrial transformation. They're creating a joint task force on critical minerals. And that was something that was really striking about this deal. It's very transparently about the raw resources.
Right.
Australia has other, it has large copper deposits too, which are also huge for the development of this technology. And basically the U.S. is saying, yeah, we need that. And it's very true that something that people don't talk about, that I at least don't hear about a lot with the green transition, is the resource needs how we are not there.
America doesn't have them in our backyard the same way. The largest lithium deposits are going to be in Australia, and I think there's big ones in Bolivia.
Chile is what I thought.
Chile has another one? Okay. Yeah. I know there is lithium deposits in Bolivia.
Okay.
And Bolivia doesn't have a government that is close to the United States. Bolivia is very anti-United States right now.
Okay.
Chile has a better relationship with the U.S. So if we can get a good solid block of raw resource negotiation between Chile, Australia, the U.S., we could have a powerhouse of green energy that can compete against China.
Yeah. But the thing is, right now, these resources aren't even being harvested and not even really close to the capacity they need to be to drive the green revolution.
So you're saying they're not being mined enough.
Not even.
The deposits are there, but we haven't even begun to tap into them.
Yes. And we've begun, but not at the right rate that we need to supply the revolution that we're talking about. Right. And so I feel like an agreement like this is important because it's we want you to step on the gas. This is what we're saying to Australia.
Yeah.
Because we are going to be there to buy.
Definitely.
Absolutely there.
Yeah. And we need to show that these investments that you make are not going to be in vain. This is a guaranteed return. We will be buying this stuff.
Yes. And knowing that the U.S. has such the U.S. is going to have the biggest solar market.
Oh, easily.
So for Australia to hear that should be extremely encouraging. That's really all I had to say about that.
Well, I wanted to talk briefly about lithium prices overall, is because in 2022, lithium hit its peak of pricing. And for the first time, lithium started going down in price this past year. So this year is the first time lithium prices are actually going down. They picked up recently. This is the first time I'm seeing these numbers. I didn't know that it picked back up, but it picked up in the beginning of May. But it's still not even close to the top. We're talking, we're talking a fraction of the cost here.
Wow.
So
I wonder why.
Stuff is happening, but it's not fast enough. But we're starting to see the trend that's going to be able to get us to that revolution. We're going to start seeing that increased production and that mineral extraction. It's amazing to see Australia and the United States work so closely together. I think Australia is actually, a little fun fact here, Australia is the only country that has followed the United States into every war the U.S. has ever got in, including Vietnam. Australia is the only ally the U.S. had who went into Vietnam with them.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last thing we want to talk about, which is going to prime us for the book we're going to read.
Yes.
Is there was a really important Supreme Court case that happened this week. I'll argue it might be one of the most important in terms of labor relations in just a very long time. Okay. I'm going to pull, I read the opinion.
Crazy.
I know.
The work this man is going into.
Well, I think it's important. And this is the type of stuff where it's this is, as I've learned reading the book where we're going to talk about, these Supreme Court cases is where our lives are made up before we even know about it. Before we cast a ballot, this is where a lot of these decisions are getting made. So the case was between the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and Glacier Northwest Incorporated. And little background on the deal. A little background about what happened here. So the truckers in the union were going to go on strike because they weren't able to reach an agreement. the Glacier Northwest wasn't being very compromising in their negotiation, so the Teamsters were going on strike. Now, the day they went on strike, they loaded up their trucks with concrete, because that's what Glacier Northwest is, a concrete transportation company. So they're driving around in their mixers, and then at like 11 o'clock a.m., they go, we're going on strike. All the Teamsters drive back to the location, drop off the trucks, and walk off the job. Now, this sounds fine. You're just going on strike. You have the right to strike in the United States. Now, Glacier Northwest is arguing that they caused intentional damage to their trucks by not emptying the concrete out of their trucks before they got out and walked off the job. And they didn't have the right to walk off the job because they damaged their trucks. Now, there's differential opinions here, because the Teamsters are saying half of our guys did empty the trucks, and it wasn't even the union telling them not to empty the trucks. This isn't personal damage. And we left the trucks on mixing, so the concrete wasn't hardening. So we did those things. Yes, you lost the usage of that concrete that you had to empty out. That concrete was gone, but we didn't destroy your trucks, and it wasn't on purpose.
Yeah.
Now, the reason that this is going to the Supreme Court is because they took it to the Washington State Supreme Court. And the Washington State Supreme Court, before it got to the Supreme Court, it goes to the trial, then it goes up, it gets appealed. Now we're at the Washington State Supreme Court, and they say, you don't have the authority to take this to court, Glacier Northwest, because any of these disagreements have to be taken to the National Labor Relations Board as per the National Labor Relations Act of the 1930s. So the National Labor Board is supposed to be the person deciding who's in the right and who's in the wrong, not any state government. This is a federal oversight thing. And this was done in the 30s to encourage unionization, to encourage collective bargaining, because a lot of states were against collective bargaining. The federal government made this board that was appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate that was going to deal with these disputes. So the state Supreme Court says, we have no jurisdiction. Glacier Northwest, move along. You have no standing. Glacier Northwest says, hell no, we do have standing, and we're going to the Supreme Court to prove it. So they go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with Glacier Northwest. Now, this is it's a really damaging hit to the labor movement, because this is stripping the National Labor Relations Board of its authority, and it's now inserting the court into labor disputes. The court now has a place in striking, in labor. And we have lived in an America where the courts were not allowed to be involved for a very long time. And what's really disappointing is this decision was 8-1. So 2 liberals sided with the conservatives. Only 1 liberal dissented. Now, the overall opinion that was approved, written by Amy Coney Barrett, who was the last justice appointed by Trump when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, she distinctly says that the National Labor Relations Board isn't totally neutered by this, and there is still a place, and there aren't so many things that we want to cut out. And she even says in this decision, like, if you're transporting produce, we're not going to punish you if the produce goes bad, because produce is expected to go bad. She says that in her opinion. What scares me is Justice Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch wrote a counter opinion. That wasn't the one that got approved. That's not the one that passed. But when you read these counter opinions, this is where the court goes. This is where, as we'll read in the book, this is where the court's culture gets created. And Thomas and Gorsuch, I want to read this part that he says here. The parties have not asked us to reconsider Garmin. And I'll talk about what Garmin is in a second. Garmin was another Supreme Court case. The parties here have not asked us to reconsider Garmin, nor is it necessary to do so to resolve this case. Nonetheless, in an appropriate case, we should carefully re-examine whether the law supports Garmin's unusual preemption regime. Now, what is the Garmin case? The Supreme Court held, this is the Garmin case, the Supreme Court held that the California Supreme Court was not entitled to award remedies against a union for picketing Because if an activity is arguably subject to the acts of the statutes of the National Labor Relations Act, the federal courts must defer to the exclusive competence of the National Labor Relations Board. So what Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch are saying explicitly is they think that unions should have to face punishment for picketing and strikes if it causes damages to businesses, and courts should have a role in deciding when those awards should be given. And this is just a obliteration of labor in America. Just an obliteration. Terrifying. It's a complete attack on the right to collectively bargain. And luckily, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who Biden recently appointed, came out in her dissent, and she says, instead of modestly standing down, the majority has eagerly inserted itself into this conflict, proceeding to opine on the propriety of the union strike activity based on the facts alleged in the employer's state court complaint. So she's siding on the side of like, look, the National Labor Relations Board is supposed to do this. What are we doing here? This is their job. We are stripping. The legislature branch of the United States has given this authority to the National Labor Relations Board. Mm-hmm. And the court, without any vote, without any approval, without any consent, is stripping away what we voted on so many years ago.
Yeah. What's hard to wrap my head around is how the two liberal justices sided against that decision. I don't know where they would be coming from.
I think that they were concerned that the union did in fact purposefully try to break the trucks.
Okay.
The unions and all the witnesses have said that they didn't. So that's just what it is. But I don't know why the liberals have decided that they now have a place in labor disputes. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I don't know. And they didn't write anything. I don't know what Justice Kagan or Sotomayor is thinking, the two other liberals. I don't know because they didn't write anything. So I have no idea. But I know that I imagine that they only signed on to Amy Coney Barrett's opinion because Amy Coney Barrett specifically put in that thing about perishable goods. And they kind of neutered it a little, kind of made it lighter, but it is so disappointing. And this is why the court system has to be changed, because we already voted on this and it's getting ripped away from us. We never consented to this.
Yeah. I mean, that's as good of a transition as we're going to get.
Yeah. So we started a new book, guys. The book is titled Supreme Inequality, the Supreme Court's 50-Year Battle for a More Unjust America by Adam Cohen.
You should show the cover.
Yeah. It's a really great book. I highly recommend it already. First chapter was awesome, and I think it's a really interesting way to study American history through the lens of the courts.
It gets deep.
Deep. And we were talking about last time when we read Stiglitz, we were like, Stiglitz isn't deep enough. Well, now we got deep enough.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've learned so much in these 50 pages.
Yeah. Well, where this is interesting too is it very much focuses on the individual people.
Yes.
Who are running the Supreme Court.
Yes. It's a very narrative book.
Yes.
It has characters.
Yes.
It has character development. It has backstabs.
Totally.
And it's all true. And that's when nonfiction books, in my opinion, are at their best.
Yeah.
When they read like a fiction. You know what I mean?
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say the introduction is not that. The introduction is more like, let's give the skeleton of where this is going to go. It honestly, in some ways, as I started the first chapter, I was like, the introduction was kind of chapter 1 light.
Right.
Yeah. It's like a lot of what is mentioned in the introduction is rehashed and then expounded upon in depth in the first chapter.
Yes. So I get like the introduction begins by showing these 3 Supreme Court cases and what they did for America. And they all relate to poverty. And it tells the story of people who are impoverished and how the state is working against them for these people to receive their welfare benefits in some way. Mm-hmm. And how the court is now working with these people on behalf of them to get them their benefits back. And you kind of see this trend through these 3 people's eyes, which is Vance, Jack Gross, Lilly Ledbetter. These people who were people. They had situations. We'll talk about I'll talk about Lily Ledbetter.
Sure.
She worked at Goodyear in Alabama, and she was paid less than all of her male counterparts. Now, she tried to get she tried to get retroactive pay because she was being paid unfairly based off gender, but the Supreme Court ruled against her and told her that she didn't meet the proper statutory limit. She's like, you have to make this complaint. The court told her you have to make this complaint within 180 days.
Yeah. And
she didn't.
Which I will note in the book notes, she didn't know that this pay discrepancy existed 180 days after it happened.
Right.
So it literally would have been impossible. And the court knew that, and they made this decision anyways.
And look, the other two cases are like that, and it's depressing, and it talks about these people's stories and how they kind of get disenfranchised and they get disenchanted with the system because they're like, I thought that this court was supposed to be here for me.
Yeah, and that's one of the big ideas, is that the court has been held up as the body that is on the side of the little guy, but it has been the exact opposite. It's been on a crusade against poor and working people.
And we see in our media, right? We see in our media, what are the big Supreme Court cases that we know? We know Brown v. Board, which desegregated the schools, which have movies made about them. We see all these different aspects of, anytime you hear about the Supreme Court, you hear about what they did that was good, how they legalized gay marriage. How, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's not their true history.
I do think this is, I'll just really quick, this is maybe turning around after the overturn of Roe. I think it's become very, like, all of a sudden the court is looking very sinister, and now you have the Clarence Thomas scandal. Yeah. So maybe this is changing.
I think there is a cultural shift in America that is now realizing, like, the court, as we'll talk about the Warren court in a bit, the court is not on your side.
Yeah. The
court has always been and always will be on the side of the big money.
Well, not always.
No, not always. Right.
Yes.
That's the exception.
Yes.
It's actually not always.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And what I want to, when we look into history, most of these court decisions have been pro-campaign finance, bad for election law, good for corporate law, bad for criminal law, favor prosecutors most of the time. But there has been exceptions. Mm-hmm. And this exception was during the 1950s and the 1960s, where we had new people and new justices come to the court that really changed the game. And some of the things that they did during this era was they desegregated schools. They gave you the right to an appointed lawyer for those who couldn't afford one. Mm-hmm. Most of my life, I thought that was a constitutional right from the beginning. I thought that those Miranda rights that they read you, if you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be given to you. I thought that was a part of America, but that was only from the 50s.
I didn't know about this either, and that's so interesting because my mom is a public defender.
Wow.
She is one of those lawyers.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And you didn't even know that it's a recent development in America. They banned prayer in public school, and they had new protections for welfare recipients, which we'll go into a lot today.
Yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, what I have... I feel like most of what this good court in the 50s and 60s did is what we're going to get into in chapter 1.
Yeah.
What all the introduction said really is the court has been more bad than good is what I have here. And yeah, I guess the one other thing is it kind of tag teamed with Stiglitz, which was so awesome. Because in the introduction, they quoted Stiglitz.
Which is unbelievable. We didn't plan that, guys.
No.
That wasn't a plan.
Not at all. But they specifically cite the growing wealth and income inequality in the U.S. as being partially a result of all these court cases. And what I'm reading this and I'm being like, okay, this is the court giving market power to these massive companies.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. That's exactly right.
It's seamless.
Seamless connection.
Completely
and
seamless.
That's again, it's like what I love reading about these books is like Stiglitz, we saw the lens of America through Stiglitz talking about wealth and inequality, right? And globalization and financialization. Well, now we're about to look at American inequality through the lens of the court system.
Yeah.
And it's going to be the same story, but we're going to learn so much more about the reasons and the people fighting on either side.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And so now when we get into very briefly, I want to talk about why the court has had a more conservative streak than liberal streak over the last 50 years. Honestly, it's because of poor liberal organization. Liberals don't have the same organizational capabilities. And we've talked about this where the Republicans have this thing called the Federalist Society that really trains people up from lawyers to judges to Supreme Court justices. They do that and they make it a priority. Liberals don't do the same. Republicans will time their retirements well. Republicans will fight hardball. They won't appoint Merrick Garland at the end of the Obama administration, right? Liberals don't play that same game. They just don't. Luckily, Ruth Bader Ginsburg not retiring in 2013, when the Democrats had the Senate, will really have some irreparable consequences that we'll have to live with for a very long time. And Republicans didn't make those mistakes. They don't. Mm-hmm. They don't make them. So that's why since Nixon, we've had a completely conservative majority of courts since Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Chapter 1. So, Chapter 1 starts with this crazy law, which we were talking about before the episode started. So, this law is called, Man in the House?
Man in the House rule. The Man in the House rule.
The Man in the House rule. So, in the 50s and 60s, there was this rule that several states had that if single mothers had a quote-unquote man in the house, they weren't entitled to their welfare benefits. And
what does it mean for man in the house, man? What does that mean?
It's just if there's someone that a single mother is regularly having sex with.
Unbelievable.
Crazy. So because supposedly the rationale behind this is that man in the house is a surrogate father and a surrogate provider, which obviously does not have to be the case.
No.
Of course not.
Oh my God.
And so it focuses on the case of Sylvester Smith, who was persecuted by this rule, and she challenged it and took it to federal court. But before I get into that, I will talk about a little bit of the overall, the bigger picture of this. So it was meant to save the government money, and it was a racist law that was meant to be able to allow these governments to clean their welfare rolls of black people.
And it was also a religious law. They don't want people having premarital sex.
Yes, and one of the I think it was the Attorney General of Alabama specifically said that if these women want their welfare benefits, they can just stop having sex.
Unbelievable.
I don't have the quote, and the quote is way better than I just said, but that is what the idea. Yeah, please find it. And the reason I can say that this was a racist law is because 97% of children who lost the welfare benefits from the law were black. And it was estimated that more than 500,000 children were being denied benefits because of these types of laws across the country. One other quote that I have here is, it reflected this view that welfare was an inducement to immoral behavior, which I feel like is a sentiment that strongly persists throughout the country's history into the present.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about this more, but the Supreme Court has a really interesting quote about poverty and whose fault it is. And these types of laws are just directly attacking the poor and saying, this is all your fault.
Yeah.
And so this is what the top welfare official in Alabama said. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Alabama's top welfare official defended the man in the house rule by saying that a mother who lost her benefits could always choose to give up her pleasure and act like a woman ought to get them back. Unbelievable.
Insane.
And what I need to get in the audience head is that this was happening when your grandmother was alive, guys.
Mm-hmm.
This is not ancient history.
Yeah.
This is when your grandmother was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
This is the people who raised your parents.
Yeah. The weird thing is, the idea that is in my head right now is we're being too dismissive of these ideas.
Yes.
Because I know there's a large constituency of people who feel similarly to this today. Feel like it is morally wrong for a woman to sleep around.
I know, and we're so disconnected from that. I can't even understand where that's coming from, to be honest. It's hard for me to put myself in that position of like trying to understand who would be for something like this.
I
can't. It's hard for me. You know? We try to be pretty good on this show by showing both sides. I think we do a pretty good job a lot of the time. We give credit where credit is due, but I don't think there's any credit here at all.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, it seems kind of ridiculous. And one of the things that the book said is, one of the arguments that was made is, why should these children be punished for actions that they have no part in? That only their mother is taking part in.
Right. This is the child's benefit. This is their benefit. This isn't the parents' benefit. This is their benefit.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, you said 97% of those children were black. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. It's painful. So then I just took some notes on the story of this particular case, because northern lawyers from Columbia in New York took the case because they were excited about the potential civil rights implications it could have, the progress they could make.
And look, this is important because now what they think is they can tie this to expanding the 14th Amendment. And we can expand the 14th Amendment to say, who does the 14th Amendment protect? It protects minorities. Well, maybe the poor is a minority. Maybe we can say that the poor have the same legal protections and rights as religious protections or race protections or gender protections. What if we expanded that to the poor, and the Columbia's University for Center and Social Welfare thinks that they could get that victory through her case?
Yes. And so that's kind of what the story of this whole chapter is the pursuit of that recognition by the Supreme Court that the poor are an underprivileged class that cannot be discriminated against for being poor.
Yes.
So Sylvester Smith wins the case 9-0 unanimously in the Supreme Court.
1968 we're in now, 1968.
Yes, and this holds that the man of the house rule violates an AFDC statute. And this is the important thing, is it doesn't make this declaration that the poor are a class that cannot be discriminated against.
Yes.
They avoid referencing the Constitution in the ruling.
Yes.
And instead say that I don't know.
Well, they said it was they ruled it through AFDC statute and directly avoided the constitutionality, and this is called constitutional avoidance. That's what this is. And the court wasn't crafting any new constitutional rights here that people could apply to other cases. That's kind of why it got 9-0. That's why it was unanimous. Because it's like, okay, for this case and for this law, we get it. But I don't want this being done on any other things, right?
Exactly.
So, and then the North Carolina Law Review, which is fairly, I think, conservative in their nature, said this. This decision very likely signifies a new role for the Supreme Court in protecting the rights of welfare recipients, though it is of small significance compared with the work yet to be done. So, maybe they're a liberal law review there. But point is, this is now the Supreme Court taking a real position on poverty that it hadn't done in the past.
Yeah. And so the book goes on and it says this was the culmination of this decades-long drive to establish greater legal rights from the poor. And so it kind of drops this in 1968 and then it rewinds back into the past. Something they talk about in the introduction, but then it gets much more specific in chapter 1. So they talk about the Warren Court. So there was a Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, nominated, I think, in 1953 or appointed in 1953.
Yes, by Dwight Eisenhower, by a Republican.
Yes.
What a mistake.
He served through 1969. And his court, while he was Chief Justice, was called the Warren Court. And it had a series of rulings in favor of the people. The chapter talks about how, or the introduction, I think, talks about how before the Warren Court, there are tons of Supreme Court rulings that rule in favor of slave owners, rule in favor of the segregation, rule in favor of corporations.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there's this outlier Warren Court. So Warren ruled for Sylvester Smith. Next, it Or no, and it also talks about how this liberal lean maybe started a little bit earlier.
Well, I want to talk about the 1938 decision, because I think this is where we really get this massive... So Great Depression happens, and the New Dealers get to Washington in 1933. Massive influx of Democrats from all over the country following FDR's path of what they want to do with the country. And there's a 1938 decision, United States versus Caroline Products. And this case expanded the Equal Protection Clause to mean special protection to the most vulnerable groups in society, but it didn't specify poor. And what is notable here is this specific footnote of the decision. It's titled Footnote 4. That's what it's known colloquially. Footnote 4 emphasized when the court reviewed most laws, they would be highly differential and rarely ruled unconstitutional, except in the case of laws that put a special burden on discrete and insular minorities. So then that asks the question, what does it mean to be a discrete and insular minority? Is poor, insular, and discrete? Poor people were seen in a better... And so that right there is the beginning of the push. Mm-hmm. Because poverty law wasn't a thing yet, but people who were interested in fighting poverty saw that footnote and were like, we have an opening now. The same way that I'm worried because of the Supreme Court this week, people will read Justice Clarence Thomas's opinion and say, oh, there's an opening there. Mm-hmm. Liberal lawyers across the country read that and they're like, oh, we have an opening. We can now fight. We have a leg to stand on now. Yeah. And that footnote 4, the battle over footnote 4, I think is kind of the whole point of the chapter.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. I want to talk a little more about Earl Warren, the man.
Sure.
So Earl Warren is such an interesting figure. The fact that he was nominated by Dwight Eisenhower and actually worked to get Dwight Eisenhower the nomination in 1952. And that's why Eisenhower picked him, was because Warren was like an ally and all that. But Warren wasn't really aligned ideologically with Eisenhower. He just wasn't. No. Warren had a distrust of corporations, a respect for workers, and he admired the Bull Moose Party. The Bull Moose Party was the progressive party started by Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 election. So he's a fairly progressive guy, but Warren didn't even support the New Deal from the very beginning. He had an actual distrust of a lot of government stuff, and it wasn't until he became governor of California where he started to come around. And this is what I found so interesting. Earl Warren pushed for a universal health care program paid for by payroll taxes in the state of California. He was pushing for that in 1948. And here we are arguing about that in 2023.
Yeah.
And I think that was incredible. So that really tells you a lot about the man. Not all great. He was in favor of Japanese internment. So obviously he has his problems.
Yes.
Right. But he also is, I think, a unique figure because he came from poverty. This is a man who came from the working class. His father was a struggling man. His mother was struggling to make ends meet with the children and the brothers and sisters he had. And he grew up around poverty. He grew up in the working class, and he knew the working class. And I think that informed a lot of his decisions on the court. And I think it informed his decisions on things like his positions on healthcare, his positions on school funding and elderly pensions.
And I think it was him who worked on the railroad when he was a kid.
That's right.
And he specifically saw that this company would kind of clean house of its workers at the end of the fiscal year so that it could pay larger dividends to its shareholders, to its owners. And because of that, he grew this distrust in corporations.
There you go.
And when you describe him, I also think about, it kind of sounds similar to how they describe a lot of the other liberal justices that served with him, that they were all of these people who grew up in poverty. They had experienced it firsthand. So they were specifically sympathetic to the movement. And it's something that the book also mentions kind of arose from the Great Depression.
Yes.
Because that's when a lot of upper and middle class people found their way into poverty for the first time, and they could become more empathetic of how terrible of a situation it is,
right,
and want to see those people get support.
And I think
they wanted support themselves.
It was the first time people were realizing like it's not their fault they're poor.
Exactly.
That's the first, because when the middle class fell into poverty, they were like, oh, it can happen to anybody. Mm-hmm. And now there was another court case in 1956, Griffin versus Illinois.
Yep.
And this was a big moment in American history. This decision presented the opportunity to make poor people a class with special protections. Unfortunately, it lost 5-4. It was unfortunate, but one of the liberal justices wrote, "What's wrong?"
Well, I think the court still struck down the law.
Yes. The court struck down the law, but the more progressive option of making the poor a protected class didn't win out.
Yeah.
Yes, they still struck down the law.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah. But they didn't get the full decision that they wanted. And that's a theme. That's a theme.
Yeah. Well, because the first instance of that it talks about is in 1941, Edwards v. California.
Right.
Where there's a challenge brought against California law where they had they just outlawed bringing poor people into the state, which also sounds insane. And
insane.
The case specifically was brought by a person who had driven his family from Texas into California to have a baby there, and he got arrested and put in jail for 6 months, and or maybe he was going to be until he appealed this. And once again, the court struck down the California law, but it was on the point that it violated the Commerce Clause.
Right.
The Commerce Clause, which says that people can't be restricted from travel within the country. It is not because the poor were a protected group that were being discriminated against.
Yeah.
So it had that opportunity. It didn't take it. It did make a little bit of progress because it had language that specifically said that because a person is without employment and without funds, and that he constitutes a, quote, moral pestilence, is not true.
That's an awesome part of the decision.
And that moral pestilence line had been used in many prior decisions.
Yes. And they totally threw that out,
yes.
Right? That's them taking the Sharpie to all of that, all in the past decisions, right? That's overruling a lot of precedent there.
Yes.
That's amazing. That was an amazing step.
Yeah.
And
this is again where I'm thinking about all the people that I assume and I think is clear based on some of the social media comments we've been getting recently, that do think that someone being poor means they have moral pestilence. And I wonder if there are ways for us to build, to try to inspire compassion.
Well, I think there are ways. You have to you have to expose yourself to that struggle of those people to understand what they're going through, or you have to read about it and watch it. And I think in the 1960s, you saw that. Because a book written by Michael Harrington called The Other America showed a detailed report of the poor in the United States. And this was the first time a lot of upper class people really got a detailed report about what was going on in rural parts of the country, in deep urban slums, what was happening. And Michael Harrington reported that to them. And I think that inspired a lot of the Johnson's Great Society movement. It inspired a lot of that because people weren't aware. And I think when we get comments online that are, what was the word? Moral pestilence? Pestilence, moral pestilence. They just don't know how bad it is.
Yeah.
And I think that if they were able to see how bad it was and understand and meet somebody struggling and have a conversation with them and humanize them, they would understand they're not bad people. They're just struggling. And it could be you. You never know when it's going to be you who needs a handout and needs a help,
Yeah.
And so you need to be willing to put your hand out whenever you can because you're going to want someone else to do the same for you.
I agree. Yeah. I think it really takes this basic shift in perspective of thinking that people are trying not to work, are trying to exploit the system.
Yeah.
And that we need to stop giving handouts from the system because we're just serving the people that are trying to exploit it. And instead, that people want to succeed. They want to live a life where they're supporting themselves.
Yeah.
But it's just not always possible.
Yeah.
And we should not punish those people.
And we get into, like, we always talk about difference between economic equality of opportunity and equality of outcome or whatever, but the Supreme Court even makes the argument later on where they're like, you don't have equality of opportunity if you're hungry.
Exactly.
You don't have equality of opportunity if you don't know where your health care is coming from, or you have to take care of your sick parents because they're too poor. You don't have equality of opportunity at that point. Mm-hmm. And that's a really important aspect of a lot of these Supreme Court cases that get decided on later on, you know?
Absolutely.
And also I want to know, Michael Harrington was actually the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
Michael
cool.
Harrington founded that organization. Yeah, he had some fights with the Students for a Democratic Society, who were the Democratic Socialists of the 60s, but that could be a conversation for another time.
All right. Wonderful. So Griffin v. Illinois happens in 56.
Yes.
They once again don't use the opportunity to identify the poor as a group that should not face discrimination. So at this time, it talks about the context in the country where support for the poor is starting to build. There are academic movements starting to say that being provided with the subsistence to live with your basic needs, such as housing and food, is something that should be given under the 14th Amendment.
Right. This is something that's coming out of lawyers now, poverty lawyers that are talking about this.
Yes.
And they're trying to plan ways about how to get this to the Supreme Court, you know?
Yeah, so that's exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. The Supreme Court had a lot of other great decisions. Douglas v. California was the big one. We talked about this. It ruled 6-3 that decided poor people have a right to a lawyer on their first appeal.
Yeah.
And then this is what I took this quote out of the opinion here. They specifically said this: an unconstitutional line has been drawn between rich and poor. And that strong language being in the Supreme Court decision, which is such a fantastic move in the right direction.
Yes.
And it's such a break from where the court has been and where it is now, right?
Yeah.
There's a really fantastic piece of that. And again, about this fight on poverty that's become more prominent in the 60s, this is what is inspiring Martin Luther King, fighting for a guaranteed job and a guaranteed universal basic income.
Yep.
The freedom budget for all, he called it. You have Johnson declaring an all-out war on human poverty in these United States. Mm-hmm. Johnson making Head Start. He made Medicare. And then we talk about how people have a right to live and what that means to have a right to live. It means having a right to food, having a right to a home, you know?
Honestly, it was kind of crazy reading this in here, referencing this as happening in the 60s, because these ideas, I mean, I don't know, maybe this book isn't accurately representing how fringe or mainstream these are, but they feel extremely fringe to me now.
Right.
And it seems, I mean, by the way it describes it, it seems like they might have been quite popular, like really on the verge of happening.
Well, Johnson had a great society and it was popular. Head Start was popular. Medicare was popular. These things were popular when they were created.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of support from these decisions. Where he didn't have support was Vietnam and stuff like that. But on these poverty issues, he was in the majority.
Well, it's so interesting because my question is, in the national narrative is Reagan the reason that this is no longer so popular, that we don't have it as part of the central narrative, and this all just seems fringe and not actually within our grasp?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and we have to address it more at some point deeply. But I think genuinely, when I want to talk about briefly about the changes of poverty over American history, and the two big decreases in poverty happened in the 30s when we passed Social Security. And it happened in the 60s when we implemented the Great Society. We have had basically the same poverty level since the 1970s. It hasn't changed. It's actually so cyclical to the American business cycle that the poverty rate is a recession indicator. That when the poverty rate gets too low, we're in time for a recession. That's how caked in our current baseline level of poverty at like 12, 11% is. And it's because government took their hands off the wheel and said that we're not at war with poverty anymore.
Yeah.
Because when we declared war on poverty in the 30s and the 60s, we kicked its ass. We didn't fix it. We didn't win. We won a couple battles. We didn't win the war yet.
Yeah.
And then we gave up.
But we could have won the war.
And we can still win the war. That's how I feel.
True.
You know?
1 sec.
Yeah.
I want to pause because I've been looking at this.
Okay.
It's been getting in my head because I feel like I just need this slight tweak. Whenever I lean back,
I
feel like I'm just a little not on camera. Oh,
okay.
Wait.
I'm still in the frame. I'm good.
Yeah, you're totally fine.
Yeah.
So wait, let me check. I lean back. I'm still in frame.
Okay. So now we're gonna transition now to more political backroom dealing, little finger type shit.
Yes, that's where I'm at. I didn't take as specific notes on this.
I don't think we need to talk about it for very long. I don't think that it's as interesting from a policy perspective. We can just kind of say how Fortas got fucked.
Yeah.
You know?
It is. I mean, that is interesting. So it's fun to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. You clap when you're ready.
So I guess the story now comes to the end.
Yeah.
Of the Warren Court, which ends up being kind of the end of this liberal streak of the court. When Earl Warren was the Chief Justice nearing the end of his term in 1968, he had 5 other liberal justices on the court, I believe. But what was happening was Lyndon Johnson was nearing the end of his second term. Earl Warren was keeping his eye on the political scene in which Nixon was starting to appear like a very viable candidate, one that had a very good chance of winning the presidency.
Right.
At the time, Warren was 77, and he didn't want to make the mistake that we were just talking about Democrats often making.
With Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Where he dies with a Republican in office.
Right.
And so he hatches a plan, and he's like, all right, I'm going to go. It's in like June of 1968, and the election's going to be at the end of that year. He says, I'm going to go to Lyndon Johnson, and I'm going to resign so that he can elevate a liberal justice to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and nominate another liberal justice.
Yeah.
So he goes to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson is like, that sounds great. That's swell. And they decide, okay, we can elevate Abe Fortas to Chief Justice. And then it goes into a lot of exposition about Fortas himself.
Yeah.
I don't have a ton of that here.
I'll say briefly. He was he grew up in destitute poverty. He was a Jewish immigrant. He grew up in the South, Memphis, Tennessee. So being a Jew from the South in poverty, it's not a good place to be. Mm-hmm. But he was inspired by FDR, and he went to Yale Law School because he was so intelligent. And he became general counsel of the Public Works Administration. And so now here is one thing I want to talk about Fortas's past, where I think is actually a really good example of Johnson and Fortas being really good friends. Fortas defended Johnson in an election case for the 1948 Texas Senate primary. This is actually really important because it has now been proven that Johnson did steal that election. It has been proven that he stuffed the ballot boxes and he should never have been a senator from Texas. He completely stole the election. And Fortas defended him in that case.
Holy cow.
Yes, it has been found out that Johnson has completely stole that election.
That's crazy.
Knowing a lot about Johnson, if you read Robert Caro's biographies, he was rigging elections since he started. He rigged the student government elections in his college.
That's insane.
So he rigged the Senate primary too.
Wow.
And then Fortas defended him. Whether or not Fortas knew the truth, I'll never know. But maybe he did.
Yeah.
Point is, Fortas and Johnson became very, very close.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So Johnson's like, let's nominate Fortas.
Yep.
And it goes to the Senate, but he starts to face opposition.
Deep opposition.
Do you hear that?
I thought that was coming from outside.
My bad. Okay, so he faces opposition on several fronts, and one is No, never mind. I think I was going to bring up something that came up later.
Okay.
In this story.
Well, so what I have from Fortas here is like there's really a couple lines of attack. The first one is he was the okay. Oh, jeez. This is the one I'll talk about first. Okay.
Okay.
He was Jew from the South. We have Southern Senator James Eastland of Mississippi saying, "I could not go back to Mississippi if a Jewish Chief Justice swore in the next president." Mm-hmm. So that's one front he's getting attacked on. Now, the next one. Fortas supplemented his salary with a lectureship at the American University Law School, funded by contributors that included some of Fortas's former clients. This isn't that out of the ordinary. Justices always have lectureships that they get paid for. But what was notable was how much money he was actually getting. It was like $110,000. That was a lot of money for them, and his appointment was popular at home with the people at a 2-to-1 ratio with some polling. But for the first time ever,
yes,
a Senate filibuster killed a Supreme Court nomination. That's what killed Garland. Mm-hmm. But now, well, that's not the only thing that killed Garland, but that's the first time that happened in our history, and I think that's a really defining moment of our division.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Fortas didn't get confirmed, but meanwhile, Warren had already sent in his resignation.
Yeah.
So the court was going to be left with an open seat.
And Nixon beat Humphrey in 1968. So now Nixon is coming in, and he is going to be able to appoint some justices right off the bat.
He's going to be able to appoint one off the bat, but he wants more.
He wants more.
The book is very descriptive about how excited Nixon gets about putting justices on the court.
Yes. Because you had 2 decades of back-to-back conservative losses over and over again at the Supreme Court level. Mm-hmm. And he views himself as a possible transformational figure to remake the country in a conservative image for a generation if only he gets the chance.
Yes.
And he's going to make the chance. He's not going to leave it up to fate. He's going to push to make sure he gets this.
Yeah. So he starts a campaign against Fortas, and he uses pretty much every trick in the book.
Yeah.
He has these subtle threats, even though they might be bluffs, but he leaks that the Department of Justice is going to investigate him. He plays up this connection that Fortas has with someone that he represented in the past.
Mm-hmm. Who was then in trouble. So this guy Fortas represented got in trouble with the SEC. And during this investigation, when this guy was getting interrogated, he allegedly dropped Fortas's name. And Fortas had no knowing of this. Fortas was not helping him. And this guy has even come out and said at a specific point, like, Fortas never helped me.
Yeah.
But he's tying him to this.
And the people in the Nixon administration even came in and said, oh, no, we didn't actually have anything on him. It was a total bluff.
Yeah, total bluff.
Yeah. But it ended up working because the pressure built, and it wasn't just that Nixon was coming at him. It's that Nixon partnered with Warren. And this is the most heartbreaking thing.
It's tragic.
Because Nixon basically charmed him.
He was too good. Honestly, I think Warren was too. He was too. What's the word I'm looking for? He was just too trusting. He was too trusting. He loved the court as an institution and what it was, and he didn't want his tenure to be remembered with these ethics scandals with Fortas. He wanted to be above all that, Yes. He wanted to be clean.
Totally. He was very invested in his reputation.
Yeah.
And that of his court.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, he started to get scared that it was going to be tarnished. And he convened this meeting with all of the justices, and he brought up these allegations against Fortas. And they were like, okay, what are we going to do about this? And I don't think it goes into detail about whether they decided on anything in that meeting. And it didn't have to, because the next day Fortas resigned.
Resigned.
And he just said that he didn't want to deal with it anymore. So now, and it was so fortunate that Nixon got Warren at this time, because he got him between when Warren had agreed to resign and before he had actually left the court.
Right.
So he really was able to manipulate that. And they talk about how there was a party in the Attorney General's office for Nixon after they got Fortas to resign from the court, because it was all bluff. Like there was nothing there behind their threats.
They threatened to go after his wife.
Yeah.
They threatened a lot, and they called his bluff, and he went away. And I think it's just unbelievable that so much that's going to happen in the following chapters is because of this moment.
Yes.
And that's what's so tragic. So much of what is about to happen, all the progress that was made during the Warren Court, so much of it is about to get railroaded because of a poor use of executive overreach. Just an unbelievable usage of the Justice Department.
Yeah.
Fortas's last vote in the Supreme Court, his last one, was for case Shapiro v. Thompson, and it overturned duration residency laws. So people were saying that besides making this did not make poor a protected class. It did not, unfortunately. And there was a more moderate interpretation that won out. And this interpretation was this law is discriminating against new residents as opposed to long-term residents, and that is an infringement on the right to travel. Now, by this point, there was a different Chief Justice of the court, William Berger. He is the new Chief Justice by this point. And he writes something. He says, he said, oh, no, he wasn't. He hasn't been. He wasn't the Chief Justice yet.
He might not have
no,
been.
He wasn't. But conservatives overall did fear that the court was close to creating a constitutional right to welfare assistance.
Yes.
Yes. And that, yeah. So conservatives are now getting very antsy with where the Warren Court is heading. And, well, they're about to have their way.
Yeah. But we'll get to that
on
our next book club segment.
Yes.
Okay. Happy note.
Perfect.
We transition to China and the U.S. So I think we're going to be looking at the relationship, but if anything, we're probably going to be looking more at China.
Yeah.
Because I think I don't think it's a lot to say that our audience is going to be more familiar with American ideology.
You think?
Yeah. So we want to get into what is China's governmental ideology? How has it been developing over the past several decades? What does their economy look like? And then what does the interplay between our countries look
How
like?
do these two ideologies interact with each other on the global scale?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we should start with kind of overview stuff. China is the most populous country in the world. It has over 1.4 billion people.
India recently passed them.
Did it?
Yeah, a couple days ago.
A couple days ago?
Maybe a week or two ago.
I really thought I checked it. Okay. China is very close to the most populous. It has over 1.4 billion people.
Yes.
It has the second highest GDP in the world, which is really what puts it at this level of like seeming to be it is the other competing world power with the US. So China's GDP in 2022 was 14.72 trillion. America's was 20.78 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
It is led by Xi Jinping. It is under communist rule, and what our author argued is that it is totalitarian rule.
Right.
And that means that the Communist Party has control over all aspects of the country. The government, the economy, surveillance of citizens, anything you can really think of, the government has a hand in.
Mm-hmm. What
has happened, and I'm jumping whenever because I'm not super organized with my ideas here.
Yeah.
Where she is right now is essentially complete consolidation of power.
Yeah.
He kind of has this cult of personality where he doesn't even have dissenting voices around him. This is really a one-man dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, obviously distinct from American ideology.
But I think that's perfect to encapsulate what China is at right now in their ideology, because China at its foundation, the People's Republic of China, was a deeply ideological project. deeply ideological, with Mao Zedong fighting revolutions in the mountains and, going around designing such bad policy around his ideology that millions of people die. He was so committed to his ideology that he was starving people. Okay. That's how committed he was to this.
Yeah.
And, people feel like people lost touch with the ideology. And then you have the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. And the Cultural Revolution was people going back to Mao Zedong and praising him and trying to get his ideas back into government about the people who they viewed as took it away in the 50s. And this Cultural Revolution, this deeply ideological movement, kind of loses face. And the deep ideology falls to pragmatism. And I would describe China's current ideology as I wouldn't even say it's a communist state. I would say it's a pragmatic state. And I would say that the Communist Party is in a fight for survival. They are in a constant fight for survival.
Yes.
And they are doing whatever is necessary for their survival.
Yeah. So one of the things this describes is like, what are the motivations?
Yes, exactly.
Of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. And it is this fear, this constant fear that it will be overthrown. And that the reason that fear is so powerful is because the Chinese government has taught its officials about what has happened to other communist governments that have fallen and shown executions, how people have lost their jobs. So these are now personal fears.
That was so interesting how they really tied the personal fears to make them like committed to the institutions.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. But meanwhile, there is another side that is a desire to spread its own hegemony, right? As it sees the US as kind of, and I would agree with this, having a hegemony over a large amount of the world. Mm-hmm. The richer, more powerful parts of the world, to be sure. I really do want to talk about this history because I'm so interested in it.
Yeah.
Because I guess I feel like my knowledge of this really starts more post-Mao. So in the 70s, because this is where the US-China relationship really begins.
Right.
After World War II, in the Cold War, the US for many years doesn't recognize like mainland China as the official China, because after World War II and like between 1945 and 1950, there's a civil war in China. And the democratic faction loses and escapes to Taiwan. They retreat. They're still there. Mm-hmm. The U.S. recognized Taiwan as the official China all the way up until 1972. Mm-hmm. Then Nixon gets into office. And Nixon kind of sees China as his pet project. He is excited about the possibility of incorporating them into the world order because he sees their massive population. He's like, they're going to, with a population this big, they're going to have to be important.
Well, so, FDR says in the 40s, during World War II, he's like, China will be one of the main five. He thinks like what FDR says, America, Russia, France, Britain, and China are the main five.
Okay.
And this is Nixon kind of reverting back to that, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so because of that, he wants to fold China in. And there's also this allure of having China as a counterweight.
To the Soviets.
Exactly. Right. And they had just had this border conflict between China and Russia that Nixon's like, okay, this is a perfect time to go in and partner with them. So Nixon has a summit, I think with Mao in 1972.
I don't know.
Where they officially recognize mainland China as the official country. And in the 70s, relations start to build. And then in 1979, there's a shift.
Yeah.
The leader of China has transitioned to Deng Xiaoping. And he visited the U.S. on January 1st, 1979. And he's super impressed with what he sees. There's a quote, I think, in this paper about how like after he's been to the US, he's like, yes, now I see what a rich nation is. And there are quotes from other members of the administration that say, we're all savages here. That's what a truly civilized society is.
Yeah.
So once they see that, he's inspired and he wants to transform China. But he needs to institute political and economic reform to get there. There's not enough money. There's not enough development happening fast enough with the communist organization that they have. So he starts by designating these special economic zones.
Yeah.
And
12 major cities along the coast.
I thought it was 14.
Might have been 14.
Doesn't matter. Basically, yeah, there are these major cities along the coast that the law designates they can be treated specially. There are a few things that this does. It grants them more capitalist freedoms, like the opportunity for trade and investment that doesn't have to be explicitly approved by Beijing, which is huge because it means foreign investment is brought in. There are business incentives for greater development. And the other thing that Deng Xiaoping did is introduce profit sharing in the government. So that the Communist Party officials that led to more growth got a cut of it. It's almost like putting the capitalist innovation incentives that we always prize so much in America.
You're folding that into the government.
Exactly. And so after that, China starts to explode economically. China's growing at least 9% per year GDP every year.
Right.
From I think 1979 all the way up through the 90s. It's utilizing these capitalistic policies to grow. But the thing is, the whole time the CCP is very careful to hold on to control.
Right. That's their fear. Yes. Their fear is like, okay, it's this counterweight of we need the development that comes with foreign capital, but we don't want any political reform. We only want the economic reform. That's really what it is. They're trying to have one without the other. And what America thinks is, well, you can't have one without the other. Nixon thinks if you do economic liberalization, political liberalization is coming whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
That's what the whole world thinks.
Yes.
China proves them wrong.
Yeah. And China is so explicit about this because they explicitly put down ideological revolutions that are moving towards democracy and towards liberalism through the 80s. There's a student revolution, I think in 1986, that ends up quietly being put down. There's an ideological revolution within the government where I think in 84 or something where Deng Xiaoping expels everybody who is on that side.
Well, there was a push to try to reform Marxist literature. There was an internal project trying to change or reimagine the interpretation of Marx that the Communist Party is based on, that the state is based on, and conservatives kicked them right out of the government.
Yeah. And that's been the pattern. And then it kind of culminated in the Tiananmen Square protests.
Right. The June 4th incident.
Yes. So Tiananmen Square happens. The West puts a ton of sanctions on China. They're like, this is abhorrent. This is crazy. And Deng Xiaoping is worried about losing the faith of the party internally because he's worried that everyone else is going to lose confidence without the support of the international community.
Right.
But he is personally defiant, and he makes speeches internally about how they don't need the West, that they have a large population and they can continue to grow economically without the external consumption.
Well, he's thinking like the West needs us more than we need them.
Yes.
The West needs us because we're the biggest market.
Exactly.
Right. That's what he's suggesting. He's like, if the Western powers will always help us grow because they know they'll be able to sell their stuff to us and they will love us. And we have them basically by the balls.
Exactly.
You know?
And so there's this is happening almost just at the same time as the Soviet Union collapsing.
Yeah.
Which is a huge shock to everyone globally and definitely to China, who's the other major communist power in the world. And so this is when Deng Xiaoping starts emphasizing a policy of what is the English translation is kind of waiting or hiding the fact that we bide our time.
Right.
So this idea that China knows that it's not ready to compete with the West on the global stage yet. So instead, we're going to keep using them. We're going to keep cooperating with them, gathering knowledge from them, gathering technology from them, selling to them so we can build up our own economic capacity.
Right.
Because we can't reveal our true intentions of wanting our own global hegemony yet.
Well, and I want to talk about briefly about, just rewind a second for Chinese history here. China was cut up and carved up by the imperial powers in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And Britain was going in there and killing people to sell their opium. And we think about the 19th century and the 20th century as the age of British hegemony, the age of American hegemony. And maybe we call that Pax Americana, the American peace, or Pax Britannica, the British peace. China has a name for that century too. You know what that name is?
No.
They call it the Age of Humiliation.
Wow.
They are done with the Age of Humiliation. In Mao Zedong, in Xi Jinping's recent speech to the Party Congress, he explicitly stated the age of humiliation is over. And when we talk about how Deng Xiaoping is talking about biding our time, China, it is now time.
Yes. So Deng Xiaoping is waiting. He's like, we're in the oven right now.
Right.
We're going to get out of this age of humiliation.
Yes.
I have a quote right here from the paper that I want to read. I feel like I should read because I put it on my notes, and so it's probably good.
Yeah.
So this says, if China wanted to enter the international economic community and use the world market to increase its national power, China could only achieve this by acting softly, lowering its posture, and keeping a low profile in dealing with the US and the Western world. In other words, China must deceive the West by hiding its long-term strategic goals, pretending to be weak and harmless in order to take advantage of Western markets, technology, capital, and talent, while waiting for the opportunity to strike back and win the ultimate war. This was an ancient strategy that Chinese emperors and kings had used many times in the past.
Wow.
I feel like that sums it up super well.
Definitely.
This point, and I think they've done it very successfully.
I think, yeah.
And there's this...
We've given them their superpower status.
She talks about how we welcomed them into the World Trade Organization. And
what a mistake.
Yeah, it's not only that we have allowed so much private investment in China, but we let them into the World Trade Organization to really kind of oil the gears on their integration into the economy. And these quotes from Clinton and Bush, I also want to read out.
I wrote those down too.
Okay, these are perfect.
Yeah, they are.
Clinton said, by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products, it is agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The more China liberalizes its economy, the more fully it will liberate the potential of its people, their initiative, their imagination, their remarkable spirit of enterprise, and the genie of freedom will not go back into the bottle. Then Bush said, economic freedom creates the habits of liberty, and habits of liberty create expectations of democracy.
Oh my God.
Trade freely with China, and time is on our side.
That is so unbelievable to look back on.
Arrogant.
Arrogant.
So naive. The thought that democracy just needs to be the end point.
And you know what's so funny? How we think about the communists as the ideologues. Those are the most ideological driven statements I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
That is deep. That is like religious. That is like religious devotion to faith here.
Yeah.
And
like was that written in Adam Smith?
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I just can't believe that was what the position was. And it was so incorrect. And China's ability to be a pragmatic state really just unbelievably, it makes itself so much more nimble and flexible.
Yes.
And in the long term, strong, because it's going to be able to do the things that are necessary. And the state is organized in a way that it doesn't have these ideological barriers to it, where that America does.
True. I mean, it has ideological barriers in that, they're not going to allow democracy to infiltrate, but because of Xi's unilateral power now, they can pivot like that.
Exactly.
And I think usually there's this idea that totalitarian governments are going to be weaker because there's not going to be as much innovation or difference in ideas.
Right, because when there's no dissent, there's no one to tell the guy no when he's obviously wrong.
Exactly. But one thing about the current structure of the Chinese government is that the provincial governments are incentivized to experiment,
right,
and to be different.
And they do.
And then she can go in and nationalize those policies. And the other thing is that, like, there has been a recent change here where so COVID happens.
Oh,
and
yeah, that was huge.
With COVID, there have been changes because China went with their zero COVID policy, and they were like, okay, we're going to prioritize just getting the fewest people infected.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were massive revolts. And those were unprecedented against the Chinese Communist Party because Tiananmen Square,
right,
it
doesn't
seems
happen.
Foolish to do that. The crazy thing is they worked, and they worked fast. She saw the protests and almost immediately reversed the zero COVID policy, which is frightening in a way because it means that, okay, it's not just one dictator one ideologue who's
right.
He's not Mao,
That's
right?
Exactly
he's not
right.
going to starve his country.
Exactly right.
Yeah, he's
exactly
going
right,
to try to win still.
Yes, he's not. He is in it for the power game, and dealing with a guy who's in it for the power game like this, not committed to an ideology. There's less things that you can get him on. You know what I mean? There's less things for you to convince the people to fight against him for if he's gonna just do the right thing.
Yes.
And the right thing is a hard word to say because is it the right thing to have a surveillance state and have a social credit system? I don't think so.
That's the thing. It doesn't matter if we think it's the right thing because his people think it's the right thing. And he establishes that through continuing to have this surveillance state, to control the media and the internet, to control the education system, to constantly push this propaganda of the power of the Chinese state and the enemy, the envious West that wants to hold China down to prevent its rise, even though China's doing nothing to infringe upon the freedoms of the West.
And that's what I think is so interesting now is China really is becoming a very nationalist state.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of new. That's a kind of a new thing. I mean, Marxism is distinctly opposed to nationalism. To be a Marxist is to be an internationalist, to be an anti-nationalist, to be a Marxist. And so now this Marxist-Leninist state is a completely nationalist Han Chinese state that is deeply infringing on the rights of racial minorities, the Uyghurs, and all the other ones that exist in Tibet. And they're doing this Sinification, which is actually very long-standing in Chinese history. Believe it or not, this isn't the first time that the Han Chinese have wrapped up a bunch of Turks and killed them all. This happened in the 1700s. This has always happened. This is a revert back to ancient Chinese policy. This is... And that's what I think is so interesting when people call and talk about Chinese communism. This is really Chinese pragmatism. And I'm going to make that point over and over again whenever we talk about China.
Good. Please do. What's so interesting is when we bring up the mistreatment of ethnic and racial minorities, is this something I've mentioned, I think on a prior episode, is you would hope that the US or Western allies would then edit trade policy based on human rights abuses. And in fact, this author brings up that through the 90s, every single year, Congress introduced legislation to try to base trade relationships with China on improving human rights abuse, like getting rid of the human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And they never passed. And it just goes to show that, like, we can posture about the moral high ground of the United States, but it's not there. We'll do anything to support our own interests.
It's hard for the United States to be on this moral high ground when honestly, this is the truth, okay? It's hard for the United States to be on this moral high ground when we are born through the genocide of Native American people, when half of our country was deeply embedded into the institution of slavery for the country's foundation. It's hard for America to do that and be this international policeman fighting for the freedom and liberties of the people abroad, and for China not to point at us and say, you did it.
Exactly. They call us the imperialist Americans
Yeah.
in their education system, which is not wrong.
It's not wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing. It's like, that is not incorrect. But does that mean like what they're doing to the Uyghurs now is okay? Absolutely not. The United States isn't doing anything equivalent to what they're doing to the Uyghurs now.
Exactly.
But go back 100 years ago, sure.
Yeah.
But that was 100 years ago. But this is why the conversations are difficult on an international level, where the United States people don't think the U.S. has a leg to stand on.
Yes.
Because of our history.
Exactly. Well, and this reminds me of like the communication that now happens about climate change and how
absolutely.
we'll point the finger at China for being the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. But really, it's like that was us 50 years ago. And all that's really happened is that China has always just been lagging about 50 years behind us.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
And also, I mean, this is another thing. When you do emissions per capita, the United States emits more than China when you do per person in the country.
Yeah.
So I think that I just what worries me is that Xi is coming up to the breaking point here, and the time to like they are going to be finished biding their time.
Yeah.
And they're about to explode.
So yes, I totally see that. I want to talk about a few. Like a little bit more of this rise, and I think we've covered most of it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a really important point that our author talks about in 2008.
Oh yeah,
yeah, which is where two things happen. The U.S. looks to be on a distinct downwards trend because we are the cause of the global financial crisis,
which does not affect China.
And they're boastful about how it doesn't affect China. Meanwhile, China hosts the Olympics.
Right.
And they look great. And they use this to propagandize the state of China. They also use it as an opportunity to implement its hardcore surveillance state. And they say that it's just for the Olympics, but looking back, that is clearly not true.
It was a beta test.
Exactly. And which is now spread throughout the entire country. So they become boastful. They start to treat the U.S. with less politeness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really started what you were kind of describing as a more aggressive, domineering, and arrogant tendency for China to project. It's projecting this idea that China will be dominance. It's projecting Chinese strength.
I think a big moment for that is in 2021 when Anthony Blinken meets with a Chinese representative in Alaska, and they have it out, and the Chinese counterbalance to Anthony Blinken really looks like an equivalent. No longer is there even the feeling of an inferiority on the Chinese side. It is a equivalent / a younger brother who just started lifting weights.
Yeah.
That's how the meaning turns out. And there's a massive shift in how China sees itself and what it needs to accomplish. But the main thing that I want to with China, wait, do you have any more on the rise?
No.
Okay. So the main thing I want to talk about with China's explosion is they're forced to explode within the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes.
They don't have a choice because China messed up with their one China policy.
One child policy.
And they don't have the population to do this at any other time. China will have a population of around 750 million by 2100.
Yeah.
And
that's about half of what it has now.
The country is going to have half of its current population. And it doesn't have a good immigration system, so people aren't going to China.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to lose half of its population. This is the last time it's going to have military-aged men, enough of them, to fight a war with the West, to fight a war to take Taiwan. This is the last time that they're going to be able to do this for 150 years. And to avoid another age of humiliation, China, I think, will do anything. And they will not go back into being second place. They will not do, and if they do it, they will not do it quietly.
So this is where we get into this idea of a Thucydides trap.
Yes.
And this is so scary. This is scary because this is also the exact rationale for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The exact same one.
The exact same thing. Because Russia has also been facing demographic collapse. but in China, I think it's more apt to use the Thucydides trap, which I'm gonna quote this article to describe it. So, about the Peloponnesian War that devastated ancient Greece, the historian Thucydides explained, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Over the past 500 years, these conditions have occurred 16 times. And what these conditions mean is a rising power that strikes fear in the heart of the already dominant power that they're going to be taken over, leading to war. Mm-hmm. It also inspires these feelings that we've already talked about, where China projects that the U.S. is envious of its rise and needs to hold it down. And the U.S. sees China as being aggressive towards it because they're like, China wants our spot.
Right.
It's what we're seeing. It is happening. It is happening. War broke out in 12 of these 16 occasions. Today, as an unstoppable China approaches an immovable America, and both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump promise to make their countries great again, the 17th case looks grim. Unless China is willing to scale back its ambitions or Washington can accept becoming number 2 in the Pacific, a trade conflict, cyber attack, or accident at sea could soon escalate into all-out war.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this. It seems so possible for this to happen over Taiwan.
Yeah. And the United States is starting to send military aid to Taiwan for one of the first times. We're starting to send guns. We're not sending soft weapons anymore. We're not sending soft support. We're sending hard support. We're giving artillery shells. We're giving weapons.
Yeah.
This is the first time we're doing that in Taiwan.
We've also signed agreements recently with the Philippines to establish more military bases. And we do have a strong presence in the Pacific. Japan is one of our closest allies.
Japan,
Korea,
Korea,
Australia,
Philippines, Australia now.
Yes.
You know, we're going to have our ties with India are not going to be like military codependence and military alliance, but India will be a counterweight to China going forward. You know?
Yeah. And it's frightening because also Biden has specifically said they will militarily defend Taiwan if China attacks it. And he's ended up rolling those back, but he's taken longer and longer to roll those back. He's let those comments linger for longer and longer. And that's where it seems like this Thucydides trap is exactly what's happening. Mm-hmm. They're letting the tensions escalate and escalate because it seems like they have to keep dissuading the other side from getting more aggressive. And the only way to do that, they think, is to get more aggressive themselves.
Right.
Weirdly enough, though, at the G7 recently, Biden made some comments about how the relationship with China couldn't be decoupling going forward. It could only be de-risk. This is something that both of these leaders are aware of. Mm-hmm. And they know how disastrous war would be. The bottom line is that it comes to Taiwan. And if Xi decides that he's going to invade Taiwan, he's going to be making a bet that the U.S. has been bluffing that they're actually going to go in and defend it.
I don't know about the logistics of actually defending Taiwan. I don't know if it's even possible.
Me neither. And I think one thing we talked about before we wanted to do this deep dive, because there's so much to talk about with the U.S. and China, is we want to do a series.
I think our next series should be about like a military thing about Taiwan.
South China Sea.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we should do that next.
We could probably just finish the episode here.
I think it's a good spot.
You can tune in next week for a deep dive on the South China Sea, everything that happens there, what are the military positions. We'll get into it.
It's going to be fantastic.
Wonderful.
Talk to you later, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.